Olá, boa noite, bem-vindo à Flup. Faz alguns anos que começamos nossa curadoria com Achille Mbembe, que certamente é um dos mais importantes teóricos da diáspora da década que ora se encerra. Ele sempre demonstrou o desejo de vir para o Brasil, um país que manda não menos que 1,5 semanal para ele. No ano passado, quase organizamos uma excursão por 6 cidades do Brasil, que terminaria de uma forma apoteótica na Flup. Não conseguimos, mas não desistimos. Não podíamos desistir, principalmente num ano como 2020, que há de entrar para a história como o ano em que o mundo ficou de joelhos. Esses joelhos têm várias camadas de significado. A primeira, a mais óbvia, mostra os joelhos do policial racista que sufocaram George Floyd até a sua morte. A segunda, a mais poética, mostra um mundo pedindo desculpas por todo o sofrimento imposto ao povo negro, esteja ele em diáspora ou em seus países de origem, na África. Mas há uma última, igualmente importante, talvez mais importante que todas as outras. O mundo de joelhos é também um mundo que começa a cair, que se rende à óbvia constatação de que a urgente reestruturação da sociedade mundial passa pelo debate racial. O mundo de joelhos é também uma metáfora tão poderosa como foi a metáfora do Muro de Berlim, que, ao cair, deu início a uma nova era. Teremos, então, nosso sonho realizado, no momento mais importante, no início de uma nova era. Com vocês, Achille Mbembe.
So the Flup Literary Festival is an online event this year, and the theme is vulnerable bodies. We're talking about the LGBTIQA+ communities. We're talking about Black and Indigenous peoples. These are crucial, topical, and universal focal points in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and the anti-racism demonstrations of 2020. My name is Iman Rappeti. I'm a journalist, I'm a writer, and I'm a businesswoman based here in Johannesburg, but I call the world my office. And it gives me great pleasure to host this conversation on behalf of Flup. Our panelist today is none other than the esteemed Professor Achille Mbembe, who has a long and stellar career. I was joking with him off camera just now that I had to really abbreviate his CV, so I'll give you some of the highlights just to share with you just how important a public intellectual and academic we have joining us for this conversation today. He is a Cameroonian-born thinker, writer, political theorist, and he has been the recipient of many accolades, including a PhD in history from the Sorbonne in Paris, no doubt, assistant professor of history at Columbia University in New York, a senior research fellow at the Brookings Institute in Washington, D.C., associate professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania, and on the list goes. He's a major figure in the emergence of a new wave of French critical theory, and he has written extensively on contemporary politics and philosophy. Among them, a book I know is big in Brazil, The Critique of Black Reason. And it is a pleasure, my friend, to have you as part of this discussion today.
Thanks, Iman.
It really is. And I don't think that did you know that the festival's been trying to get you for the last 5 years to be a part of their proceedings. So I know that this is a victory for them and a great honor. So thank you on behalf of the festival organizers. So I think the appropriate place to begin is to really recognize the context of the world in which we live. So much is happening And it feels like in some ways there is a convergence of very specific themes, calls for justice, things like the recognition that the wealth in the hands of an elite is a grotesque blot on the world, effectively, in a context of inequity. And these things, of course, have been magnified by COVID-19. How would you characterize our world right now?
I would, what strikes me the most about the moment we are going through is the amount of brutality that is unleashed almost everywhere in our planet. Brutality against nature, the environment, brutality against those amongst us who are the most vulnerable, and brutality which is epitomized by the kind of economic system we live in, which is appended by technological developments of a caliber we have never seen before in the history of humanity. So the combination of technological escalation and forms of violence, both archaic and futuristic, that combination has left many people on the pavement. So the question of who counts and who doesn't, and what to do with those we believe do not count, that question has gained attraction. It didn't have, say, 50 years ago.
Just the last bit about, the systemic, kind of like, the institutionalized things that keep us in the type of scenario that we find ourselves in.
So the combination of technological escalation and the brutalization of the weakest amongst ourselves, this seems to me to have raised to a dramatic level the question of who counts and who doesn't, and what to do with those we believe do not count. How do we treat them? How should we, attend to their needs or not? All of this, it seems to me, has made the period we live in extremely tricky.
There's a beautiful metaphor that has sort of pirouetted into my mind as you were characterizing it in that way. We are in an age where we have never had as much information as we do now, but our consciousness is impoverished. It's akin to having a library of books, but when you open the book themselves, the pages are empty.
Yes, you're absolutely right. The amount of knowledge we possess right now is astounding. The amount of that knowledge that is accessible is also amazing. And yet, the paradox is that the level of ignorance and willful ignorance have never been as high as they are now. It's probably because ignorance is the daughter of irresponsibility and indifference. Ignorance is cultivated as a strategy both by those who dominate and some of those who are dominated, a strategy to not take responsibility for either oneself or even less so for the state of our world.
Yet what's fascinating is that we haven't abandoned our ability to coalesce and to galvanize around issues that we feel very, very strongly about. And I think that builds into the question around those who have become almost martyrs and figureheads in mass protests that we've seen around the world. People die every day, and they die under really terrible circumstances, whether it is police brutality or assassinations, yet some deaths have the ability to really galvanize both the community the person was in, the country they live in, and then across the globe. I mean, when we think about what happened with George Floyd, for example, or even before that time, we think of Martin Luther King, Marielle Franco, Adama Traore, and now, as I mentioned, George Floyd. Why are some deaths, especially in a scenario of necropolitics, just not tolerated, where the world says, enough, no more?
Those deaths or those murders, assassinations, talk about George Floyd, he was murdered. His death was not at all accidental. It appears to be an accident, but it's not. Those deaths that tend to speak, by which I mean to be more than just my own death. Those deaths that become, which we experience as the death of more than just the individual who is being put in a grave, are usually deaths that speak to a cause. A cause many recognize themselves in. You mentioned Martin Luther King, Marielle Franco. These were individuals who, during their lifetime, were committed to a cause. And they died as a consequence of their commitment to the cause of justice, in the case of Martin Luther King in particular. And in that sense, he was a martyr of that cause, which spoke well beyond himself, his family, America. It spoke to the world at large. George Floyd's death is of a different type. It happens as the result of the workings of a system that has been there for a long time, that pretends to be invisible, and yet we see its results in terms of the lives that it's breaking. Not every single kind of life, but the life of black people. So Floyd is the victim of the war that has been waged against black people. I would say worldwide, but in particular in those societies that underwent the experience of slavery and colonialism. And his death spoke to the world at large because it was a scandal to common sense.
Is it more amplified because we can see ourselves represented in that story?
Definitely we can see ourselves being put to death during those 8 minutes and a number of seconds during which he is pleading for mercy. And all that he is getting as a response is more cruelty. And that's why I say it's something that a scandal against common sense, against the very idea of what it means to be human, which means to respond to a plea that is addressed to us and do something about it.
I mean, we'll tease it out a little bit more, because I think it's an important pathology for us to pick apart a little bit more so that we understand more succinctly why the world is able to coalesce or to galvanize around something, and why in some ways it's not necessarily a single story, but a multiplicity of stories that converge in a moment. Yes. That then breaks the whole thing open. Because what is the difference then between the death of a Marielle Franco and the death of Claudia Silva? Claudio was filmed being dragged by a police vehicle after being shot in a police operation. The question is, what is so intolerable about the death of George Floyd to trigger a worldwide movement of indignation when we see these types of abuses, these horror stories in many different parts of our world?
It seems to me that what is necessary is you need a community in the strong sense of the term. You need a community that acknowledges that something has happened, and a community that takes care of the event that has happened, embraces that event as an event about which the community is not just an observer. The community is implicated in its very being in that event, and it takes responsibility for it. So without the existence of that community that gives a meaning to the death that has happened, many deaths become purely anonymous. So building those communities and organizing what you call the convergences is the key in order to turn these traumatic moments into moments of high mobilization in search for a different mode of existence.
So Professor 321, so Professor Mbembe, when we think of the civil rights movement of the 1960s and the Black Lives Matter movement today, what are the similarities and the differences between those two seminal movements?
The key similarity is that they are both fighting for racial justice, which means that the question of systemic racism hasn't been resolved just by the civil rights movement and the access of blacks in America to citizenship. But it seems to me that the Black Lives Matter movement is going a bit further, in the sense that it is aiming fundamentally at putting an end to the war against black people in America, which is a war that has been going on since the times of slavery. It wants to achieve this through a set of practical political propositions, such as the demilitarization of the police, such as the redirection of huge military budgets towards a whole set of social goals like health, education, housing, community participation. It wants to re-engineer the practice of democracy in America. In all of this in relation to a care, a concern for the state of our planet. So it's a broader goal which assumes that by taking black life seriously, we'll be able to open up a space to reimagine our world at large.
I think it's important to belabor the point because there's a strategy embedded in what you said. In the previous two questions about why this moment, this movement now, when we've had similar horrific acts of violence that happened, what is, in some ways, the magic of this moment that allows it to have longer legs and to force the world into a position of really looking at itself? Let's bear in mind that the Flup Festival theme this year is around vulnerable bodies. We're talking about LGBTIQA+, we're talking about black women, we're talking about black communities around the world. And I think there's an important hack or a strategy that you alluded to in your earlier answer around what makes that moment more than just an abrogation of justice at any given point. And you talked about how communities, when communities get involved, and when suddenly people say, not in our name, or they amplify what happened, that is one of the tools that we can use in other communities who might sadly have to experience this kind of tragedy. That those are some of the strategies that, as the rest of the community, we need to employ and to harness to make it a moment where those who are guilty are held to account.
Indeed, we are going through such moment of huge demand for accountability. We see it here in where you and I live in South Africa with the so-called decolonization movement, the injunction to decolonize, which means to bring to an end a set of relations of subjugation and subordination that have structured the world order at large. Not only the USA, not only South Africa, not only Brazil or the rest of the continent, but the entire international order, to decolonize it. But decolonization involves, of course, assembling a community, reassembling a community, reimagining who belongs, under what conditions, reimagining modes of caring, taking care, in particular of those lives that are the most exposed to all kinds of risks. So it seems to me that that reimagining of the community, that recalibration of modes of coming together around that which is common, all of that is an impetus Black Lives Matter has redeployed in a context, once again, which is highly technologized, using, of course, all the devices we use nowadays in order to call for people to come out.
I think our Brazilian counterparts might indulge us on the next point I'm going to make, which is on the concept of Ubuntu. Because the concept of Ubuntu in South Africa is the seeing of the other person, the I am because you are. And if your neighbor is in misery, if they are suffering and they haven't had bread, you cannot sit down and eat. You cannot sit at your table and enjoy that meal. And it segues into the concept of community. Our community is not just our family and our immediate surroundings. If they are well, we can be well, and we can be well for longer together. And so there's a shift in that consciousness as well in this really selfish world in which we live.
Mm-hmm. You see, part of what strikes me is, let me just come back, since our interlocutors, as Iman said, are Brazilians. Iman used the term Ubuntu, and she explained it really well. Ubuntu has to do, as she argued, with the idea of the community, the idea of that which we have in common. That which we have in common, which makes it such that I am because you are. That element of mutuality and reciprocity, without which we can forget about politics, basically, about well-being, and so forth and so on. And therefore, my feeling is that most of the struggles we are witnessing in our world today have to do precisely with the refusal by some to embrace the idea of community. The desire we see all over the world, the desire of apartheid, to put it in these ironical terms, that people don't want to live with others any longer. We see it on matters of immigration, the ways in which our cities are built, the emergence of countless enclaves, the difficulty we face to make a space for the other in our midst. And therefore, the project of Ubuntu becomes absolutely important in that context, which is characterized, maybe we haven't highlighted this strongly enough, by the impending ecological catastrophe the world is facing. It's not at all clear that we will be here, let's say, in 100 years, that the human species will be alive. Because part of what is going on, and we have seen it in Brazil, I mean, with all that is going on in the Amazon, the fires, the so-called crisis of climate, what is at stake in those transformations is the possibility of our very survival as a species. So we won't be able to survive if indeed we do not bring back at the center this idea of the common, of the in common, of the community, and reimagine it. And to reimagine it means confronting racism at its core.
And again, the structures that enforce that experience in the world. You spoke very early on about reshaping our economies, and we know that debate very well here in South Africa. We can have a series of laws that give black people access to opportunities and approximate them, to the seat of power, but it doesn't translate in numbers that really show that there has been a real plate tectonic shift, if you will, towards an equitable work environment, economy, representation for black women specifically. So those are the structures we need to dismantle. How does one begin that? When, as we're told, while you're ruminating, year after year, in an Oxfam report, that a certain percentage, of the world, the world's wealthiest will own, 1% will own half of the wealth of the rest of the world. I mean, these are staggering numbers.
We shift the pendulum, first of all, by initiating new forms of organization. We have to reorganize. We have to learn once again how to organize. How to organize at a time when what we are fighting against is becoming more and more invisible, more and more virtual, more and more digital and immaterial. Capitalism, because that's really the core. I mean, what we're talking about is a system, the capitalist system, in its neoliberal incarnation. All of this is becoming more and more algorithmic. It's proceeding no longer via matter as we knew it, but more and more and increasingly through technologies that are almost untouchable. So how do you fight against that which is untouchable? A bit like the virus, like COVID. I mean, we know the virus is somewhere here, but we can't see it, we can't touch it. Capitalism is turning into that kind of enemy, quote unquote. So we have to, come up with a different intelligence of the struggle in conditions that are becoming more and more virtual, immaterial, and ever more so brutal and violent. So it seems to me that we won't do it without reimagining what it means to fight. We won't do it without reimagining the finality of the economy. What is the economy for? The economy has nothing to do with the destruction of the planet. When understood properly, we cannot keep going on with an economic model which results in the very destruction of the biosphere. Because if we persist along that trajectory, it is our own survival that will be at stake. Not as Brazil, not as South Africa, not as Iman or myself, but the human species at large. So humanity cannot go on destroying everything around itself. Nature, animals,
each other,
the environment, each other, and hoping that something good will come out of that. So it's an entirely different paradigm that we have to come up with. And this one has to be built on the care and concern we exhibit in relation to both humans and non-humans. And by the way, you were mentioning Ubuntu. The concept of Ubuntu, we tend to forget, is more than about humans. It's about the universe at large. It's about the concern for life at large, the living species. How to make a space for all the inhabitants of the earth, the only one we have, the only one where life exists, which we have to share as a precondition for our own survival. It seems to me that the grand horizon we need to begin to think about, as well as the strategies and the mechanisms to bring it into being. So it's a big task. That's what Black Lives Matter is all about. It's not simply about black people, by the way. It's, we tend to forget, but when we read the pronouncements of those who are involved in the movement, it's not just about black people. In any case, the way black people have always been treated in modern times, many others who are not black in the vulgar sense of the term are being treated like that. And the way they used to treat us, they are now treating many more others exactly in the same manner. So it is, and it is beyond a racial matter. It's about the survival of the human species, and especially those who are the most vulnerable amongst us.
If the world is not waking up, it certainly needs to wake up in this moment. And as you talk about all of these themes, and it's interesting, there is no singular theme. Everything, in the same way that our biosphere is interconnected, the way we as humans coexist is also interconnected. Our fates are intertwined, whether we like it or not. Talk to us then and share with us your reflection on the participation of the descendants of enslaved people. You would have seen in the news recently some moves again towards the discourse around correcting the past, colonial powers. Well, I haven't seen anyone really apologize for what they've done in the name of expansion. But the participation of descendants of enslaved people who are at the basis of, for example, the formation of the US, what is the impact of the children and even the grandchildren of the new migratory waves?
But they are part of that history, whether they like it or not. I teach in the US at least once a year. I have seen them. You have, of course, African Americans who are descendant of African slaves who were transported in the New World. And then you have had many different waves of migration. The most recent dating from the last quarter of the 20th century, early 21st. These are not slaves. They don't arrive in America as slaves. They arrive in America as daughters and sons of people who are well educated, who are diplomats, who have studied in great institutions. You have that. You also have, of course, a more underclass form of migration. They go there. They are not Americans in the traditional sense of the term. But it doesn't matter. From the moment you are a black person on earth, or from the moment you are a descendant of an African, your fate is immediately linked to the fate of Africa. Whether you want it, you like it or not. First of all, you are perceived as such. And second, as long as Africa is not standing on her own feet, you won't be able to enjoy the benefits of full humanhood. It doesn't matter where you are. So it's not a matter of choice. It's a matter of commitment to redrawing, let's say, the map of the human in relation to matters of race, gender, but also in relation to what we were talking about a moment ago, the whole world of the non-human, the biosphere, the ecology, the environment, nature, and so forth and so on, and reimagining something new. That's how I see it. So racism, the fight against racism, is intrinsically connected to, for instance, the fight against, let's say, planetary climate injustice. The two are absolutely connected. We won't save the planet if we do not fight against racism. And in order to defeat racism, we will have to attend to the decisive matter of the future of our planet. And that's what I see, for instance, emerging, this new planetary consciousness, which is still extremely fragile, but which forms as a common ground where people of all colors, creeds, genders can transcend the aporia of identity politics and commit to the in common, that which is common, which we were calling Ubuntu a moment ago.
You are credited with already writing or painting on our canvases for the longest time through all the books that you have produced, the conversations that you have had in society. And that for me is where intellectualism, the specialized knowing is of benefit to humankind. Otherwise, the intelligentsia or the learned class have these conversations that perambulate around certain places and themes and among certain people. And the greater society is always deprived of that kind of nourishment of philosophy and deep thinking. The Black movement had few theoretical references. In the 80s, you had W.B.E. Du Bois. I always say Du Bois, and then I was told it's Du Bois. Frantz Fanon, M. Césaire, in addition to the generation of Pan-Africanists formed by Leopold Senghor and others who fought for the independence of African countries throughout the ages. And nowadays, several important movements of thought from different countries are feeding the thinking and the motivation for why young people in particular take to the streets. The English school, whose epicenter is Stuart Hall's cultural studies. The American school, which includes the black feminism of people like Angela Davis. I mean, the list is just on and on and on. And we think about your book as well. The critique of black reason can be seen as a counterpoint to Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason. To what extent can we now say we are experiencing or seeing what is an extension of the reading of these intellectuals, and what impact do they have on the activism that we see today?
I am very optimistic about what is going on. first of all, we have a new generation of intellectuals who are coming in the aftermath of those you listed. A new generation of intellectuals, most of whom are women, at least in the definitely. We do not talk as much as we should about them. For instance, in a country like France, Aïssa Traoré has been at the forefront of a new movement that links some of the thinking you were referring to and the current situation of young black people and beyond that, in the banlieue, for instance. She is an intellectual. She is an organic intellectual. Most of those who launched Black Lives Matter in America are women. So something is in gestation there. We have to pay attention to this. The same thing goes for the domain of arts in general, because a lot of black diasporic intellectuality emerges out of that field. It is a field that is in a phase of renaissance, I would say, with new connections being made between the diaspora and the continent, a new geography of thought within the continent itself being articulated, as I said, about the question of decolonization, but it also goes beyond that. It takes Africa as possibly the place, one of those places on earth where the future of the planet is being played out. It's thinking in terms of African futures, which are not necessarily futures similar to what we have gone through in the past, colonialism, exploitation, and so forth and so on, but which are futures of possibilities and potentialities. So all of this means that there is a huge reservoir of ideas which is there, which is being tapped into by some movements, not many, but which is in need of being turned into, as you were calling it, a mass movement, so as to affect actual practices in specific locations.
And this is where, the frustration lies, is that we have the most amazing, forward-thinking thinkers on this continent who have as their earliest teachers the Senghors and the Césaires and the Fanons, who have impacted what we refer to as African intellectualism. And yet we are still, and again, a continent with the massive kind of opportunities that we see in terms of the youth population boom, the deposits of wealth that we have in our earth, under the soil here on the continent, which gets sent elsewhere for beneficiation and sold back to us at 10 times the price. How is it then when we are, the reservoir of all this amazing forward thinking, but we haven't yet had a movement that sweeps across our continent and in places where people who have their roots in Africa live in a significant enough way that is able to shift the needle and say, this far and no further?
It's coming. It's coming.
It's coming?
It is coming. And that's my belief. But it needs a push. First of all, it needs to get out of these reserved spaces. It needs to be popularized. And in order for it to be popularized, we need to open Africa to herself. That's a precondition. The continent is gigantic in all senses of the term.
30 million square.
In its superficie, geography, in terms of what it has underneath its soil, the amount of wealth that is deposited in the bowels of the continent, in terms of the other amount of natural capital it has, its rivers, its forests, its deserts, everything. It is a power in reserve, Africa. But that power in reserve, we have to turn it into an actual power for the benefit of African people, people of African descent, but also for the benefit of humankind at large, because all of this is interconnected. But to achieve it, we have to turn Africa into a vast space of circulation, opened to itself to begin with, which requires a methodical phasing out of its internal borders, but which implies also turning the continent into a place of hospitality for anyone on earth who is running away from risks or danger. And we have to open the continent to its diasporas. So the connection with Brazil, the connection with America, with other parts of the world where there are substantive communities of people of African descent, that's absolutely capital. And it cannot be done spontaneously. It has to be planned, it has to be executed in a long-term perspective. We have, for instance, to make it possible for black people in America, in Brazil, and elsewhere, who want to come back and resettle in the continent, which means extending citizenship to them in case they want to do so, or making it possible for them to go in and out. Since now we live in a world where circulation is absolutely important, where people need to be in many places at the same time, we have to do that. A place like South Africa, which is to some extent, after Haiti long ago, 250 years ago, South Africa at the end of the 20th century, South Africa has to take the lead in reimagining this diasporic global community in exactly the way the thinkers you are referring to spoke about it from the 19th century on. So it's a huge task which is political, which is artistic, cultural, and intellectual, which requires many different movements, organizations. That's really the task of the century. Yeah. If by the end of this century, Africa cannot stand on its own feet, then we'll have a serious problem.
I mean, I think it's interesting you talk about the paradigm shift or the shift from hostility to hospitality in a real material way. Hopefully things like the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, those kinds of arrangements will move us in the correct direction.
They have to move us there. There are many other steps we can take. I mean, some people say, oh yes, we cannot abolish overnight borders inherited from colonialism. Of course, we cannot just wake up and then it has to be prepared, it has to be planned. We can do many things, such as allowing for the obtention of visas at arrival for anyone traveling with an African passport in our own continent. We do not need to replicate in our continent the strictures, anti-immigration, anti-African strictures embedded in immigration policies in Europe, for instance. We have to turn our back to that, open the continent. That's how we will turn Africa into its own center and turn it into a place of hospitality for those of us, those of ours, who are persecuted by racist policies everywhere in the world. But that's the horizon. And we have to turn it into a historical reality during this century.
It goes to, the repainting or the recasting of what the African story is, and it's not just a single story, as Chimamanda Adichie Ngozi is one to say, and it brings me to her presence in the context of mainstream, where through her works and the writings of others, even the movie, for example, Black Panther, which seemed to capture the imagination of so many black people around the world who could finally see themselves in a movie in a way that was empowering, where the black person was the superhero, and there was the existence of a magical, powerful place that was, created by black people. And so these reimaginings, but more than that, just the moving from what's deemed to be the parochial and the niche into the mainstream is happening through writings like people, by people like Chimamanda, and movies like Black Panther, and even a continuing rise in the crossing over of African literature, art, intellectualism. How do you think that has manifested in the mainstream culture? Has it kind of, stripped the world, in a sense, a little bit more of the ignorance that they might have had? I'm talking about the rest of the world outside of the continent, about who we are in this place.
We have to do it at two levels. We have to do it for ourselves in the task of building, I would call it an Afropolitan sphere. Afropolitan in the sense that Africa is part of the world. It is the world. I cannot imagine the world without Africa. It would, no, but it's impossible. I mean, it's impossible to imagine a world in which Africa and Africans don't exist. It would be some other planet or... So, if it is impossible to imagine the earth without an African presence, then we have to shift our minds. We have to shift our mind in two ways. One, in terms of reconceiving this continent as the birthplace of humankind.
But it is the mother continent.
Which it is.
Yeah, every human being had their start.
And therefore everyone has a stake here. It all started here, and it might all end here. Not only looking to the past, but more importantly looking at the potentialities, the possibilities, the futurities. So how is it that we write Africa into the future history of the earth? It seems to me that is the fundamental intellectual, but also political and artistic challenge of the 21st century. I say it strongly because, in fact, by the end of this century, most people on earth will be living here, just as a result of sheer demographic transformations. The biggest number of young people on earth will be coming from here. So the future is written into this place, and we have to write this place into the future, into the future of the earth. That is the political and philosophical challenge, an artistic challenge. I keep coming back to this question of art and aesthetics as absolutely foundational if indeed we have to change the story. Not only change it, but enrich the story, because as it is spoken about now, it is an impoverishing story. Anyone who writes the history of humanity, the history of the earth, by subtracting Africa, is impoverishing us all fundamentally. So it seems to me that is what is going on. So you mentioned Black Panther. Black Panther is a mosaic of all those debates that have been going on, in fact, from the 19th century up to now, about how is it that we turn this continent into its own center for our sake, but also for the sake of the earth. It is a summary of all those discussions. And it opens up our imagination to that time when to be black won't be a liability anywhere in the world. Because so far it is. That's why George Floyd is killed. That's why Marielle Franco is killed. That's why those people are brutalized. Not accidentally, but as a result of an organized system that has been waging a war against black people for a long time. So to put an end to the war against black people, we have to undertake these efforts, most of which are mental and intellectual.
It goes back again, and isn't it just so beautiful how a lot of these themes superimpose themselves on the other? Because if you think about vulnerable bodies, again, the theme of this literary festival, if you think about LGBTIQA plus communities, highly invisible in many spaces, especially on this continent where there are laws to write them out of existence. When you think about the concepts of Ubuntu, where it is about the gaze, when you see someone in whom you can see yourself reflected, you are less willing to harm that because you realize by harming them, you're harming a piece of yourself. And so the question is, even though we've had these movies and we've had these amazing writers who show us that Africa is not one-dimensional, this brutal face that needs to be re-brutalized in a contemporary setting where the shackles are not physical, but they are emotional and they are psychological and they are economic. Are these enough to redirect the world's consciousness? Are they enough to change the lens with which we see the thing that we otherize, the communities that we otherize and render invisible?
You see, perceptions will change the day Africa stands on her own feet. That's the generic response. As long as we seem to not be able to stand by ourselves on our own feet, perceptions will remain the same. So the way we change them is by taking care of ourselves, turning this huge, magnificent region of the world into a big, hospitable place for life, for that which is alive, for the living. That's how we turn our back to long histories of brutalization elsewhere, but also here, because the two are connected. So, if we are to bring an end to the brutalization of blacks, to the fact of them being exposed more than any other group of people to premature death, that you die before your time has arrived. That is, the conditions are such that you might have lived 70 years, but you will only live for 35 years. Not as an accident, but because that's how things are made. Things are made, organized, legislated for in such a way that you will never reach 70 years. You will always reach half. You will disappear before you reach it. Premature death. That's what we have to bring to an end. If we bring it to an end here, if we show signs already that is happening, perceptions will begin changing. So the two things are connected.
Yeah. Well, how do we amplify that? I mean, we spoke about totems. In a sense, you know, a totem is a George Floyd. In a sense, a totem in terms of the living would be the contributions that great writers and great filmmakers make to the cause. In the sports field, you know, I mean, we saw in the United States, in the NBA, they've taken a very explicit stance against police violence. It's a turning point. A lot of people are reflecting in the importance of training young athletes in, for example, you know, universities in the US. Those institutions that would provide scholarships for, you know, young black people with talent that can be nurtured and grown very specifically, very conscientiously. Magic Johnson, remember, you know, talking about the HIV virus, for example, that giving, you know, allowing us a moment to see it in a way that is different to the death and devastation that was painted when we didn't know too much about HIV. Seeing someone, in other words, is what they would say in politics, a peripatetic face for hire, or, you know, somebody who has a powerful platform that everyone can see themselves represented in, and it gives a certain sense of legitimacy. Do we need more of those totems?
Yes, we need many more people who have a voice, because these people have a voice. They not only have a face. Sportsmen and women have a face, of course, but this face has to be turned into a voice, and a certain kind of voice. You mentioned some of them. In soccer, for instance, people like Lilian Thuram, who won the World Cup in 1998, I think, who has become a writer, an amazing philosopher, who has just published a few days ago a new book called White Thinking, which is a frontal engagement with the drama of racism, and how is it that we transcend it. So people like that, we need more, but we also need to expose them to others with whom they can learn. Expose them to writers, journalists and thinkers like yourself, musicians. We need a transdisciplinary symphony, if you want, between all these talents, so that writers don't write alone in their corner, while sportsmen are playing and women playing in their corner. And we have to institute dialogues across all these platforms, both within the continent and with the diasporas. I really believe that we need an entirely new approach in relation to African diasporas. And African diasporas in the largest sense of the term, not only in the United States of America, but also in Brazil. After all, Brazil is, probably after Nigeria, the second biggest black country on earth. So it doesn't make any sense that we do not entertain more constitutive relationships with Brazil. So I'm not only talking about old diasporas, because they are new geographies of diasporas that is emerging, which of course includes also parts of Asia, in particular China. China has become an African question, if you want, if only because of its implication in our present and in our future. In fact, not only did we have a problem with the West, but China has become an African problem. And we have to think of our position in the world in relation to this emerging power, which is present in our midst and will be so more and more.
I mean, my observation listening to you is akin to being in a room that has been starved of oxygen, and then you crack open a window and the oxygen just flows through, and it's so refreshing. When you talk about things like transdisciplinary symphonies, it just, you know when you hear something and you realize that it's right, but you haven't heard that before. I think that's so powerful what you're saying, because again, given the interconnectedness of the world in which we live, that suddenly you can't see things in silos anymore. Everything has an impact on everything else. I really appreciate that perspective, and I think that it is something we have to focus on a lot more keenly in taking things, amplifying them, kind of repackaging and redirecting them for real change, the kind of change that shifts the needle. What do you think then is the role, I mean, you've touched on it variously in our conversation now, the role, for Africa in global anti-racism movements. In asking the question, I recognize that it's also tough for me to ask the question. Because, for example, here in South Africa, you're dealing with the hangover of apartheid, whose shadow still stretches very definitely over this new dawn of democracy that we experience. Systemic racism exists. You will see protests just recently around the characterization of black people's hair. We are living, and we continue to live, with the legacy of apartheid thinking, and a non-materially reconfigured economy. And so we think, okay, so we're busy fighting our own battles. How can we lend some troops to fight this other battle somewhere else? So how do we fully become part of that and they become part of us?
I think that Africa, in general, has a fundamental responsibility when it comes to this question of the global struggle against racism. It's, of course, a global issue in the sense that it should concern every single human being. But I think that we haven't played, as a continent, the role we could have played. And I talk about the continent in general. I'll say one word about South Africa if you want. We have to take responsibility for people of African descent all over the world. We owe them to take that responsibility.
Who is we?
Africa. Now we can say who in Africa? Is it the AU? Is it, are we talking about individuals or small organizations? All of us. But we need an official voice to speak on behalf of black life wherever it is harmed or threatened in the world. We haven't had it. When George Floyd is killed in Minnesota, we need the African Union to speak and to testify on behalf of his life and the lives of all those in America who have been killed as a result of structural racism. I say America, it could be elsewhere.
But what about on our very own continent?
I'm coming to our own continent. But you ask me whether Africa may play a role. I'm saying this is what role it should play. It should take responsibility for people of African descent wherever their life is threatened all over the world. it should be on our mind, in our thoughts. It should be at the center of our international relations with other nations. So far, that is not the case. And African people have the right to ask that this be the case, that it should be placed at the core of Africa's international and geopolitical relations. But we cannot go on taking responsibility for the lives of black people in other countries if we do not take responsibility for the lives of our own people. And we still live in the continent with political regimes that brutalize the lives of their people when they do not abandon them entirely. So, as we were saying early on, this is a dialectical thing. We have to hold both at the same time. South Africa is a huge symbolic asset in this, let's say, configuration. It is a huge symbolic asset for all kinds of reasons. And one wishes that South Africa would stop navel gazing. It is a huge symbolic asset in the sense that at the end of the 20th century, colonialism, racism, and imperialism were defeated here. And we have to take seriously that defeat. Although it is, of course, incomplete, but they were defeated here. Because in South Africa, we had the most brutal instantiation of the denial of our humanity in the African continent. This is where it happened. And that's no longer the case, at least symbolically. Now we have to turn the symbolic aspect of it into something practical, which means, of course, deracializing the economy, which means opening up South Africa to, as the Freedom Charter puts it, to all who live in it. And the goal of opening up this nation, country into, let's say, to all who live in it is a universal goal. It's not simply South African. We have to open the earth and all its inhabitants to all who live in it. And in that sense, South Africa is like, let's say, an abstract summary of universal aspirations. And it has to embody them in its politics, in its relations with other nations, and assume them fundamentally. One last point about South Africa. You see, black people are not a minority here. And that must count for something. They are not a minority here. This is, in fact, the only place on earth where black people rule over a powerful and substantive white minority. There's no other place on earth where you have this configuration. So it must mean something, I don't know exactly what, but for me it's absolutely empowering. Provided, of course, we tease out the political, philosophical consequences of what it means. You see, I wouldn't, of course I would be happy to live in other parts of the world, but if I have to live in Africa, I find it really refreshing to live in South Africa.
I'm so glad you said that.
For all these reasons.
Yeah.
For what it opens up in terms of potentialities, what we can do, which we might not have done yet, but we can do so much. And one really wishes this country would embrace that
that opportunity.
Yes.
Well, we're so glad to have you.
And drive it. And drive it for the benefit of humankind, frankly.
There is another story that can be written about us, and I love the way you put it, and that's why I'm saying, I just am really enjoying this conversation, because when you talk about this country in terms of its legacy being a symbolic asset in the world, there's a real power in that, and I appreciate you. We can't talk about politics without talking about religion and the sources and the wells from which, various communities of us draw from. Religions play a fundamental role for black people. This is undeniable, especially when we talk about black people of popular origin. So we can't think about the anti-racist struggle in the US, for example, without thinking about the Protestant churches. And of course, one of the greatest products of that was Pastor Martin Luther King. In Brazil, the largest black country outside Africa, as you already reflected, candomblé plays a central role in the identity of black people. Even young people who've been raised in evangelical churches seek candomblé, which is voodoo, or the characterization of voodoo. But they understand themselves as black people and realize that they need to participate in anti-racial struggles. Africa is a continent predominantly influenced by so-called African religions. Islam and Christian churches are also deeply implanted on the continent. Bearing in mind this complete diversity and sometimes complicated nature of religion, what would you say the role of religion is in Africa's greatest political clashes?
See, ours is a continent that has been hospitable to all manifestations of faith, whether they take the form of churches or not. We are probably the one place on earth where we are willing to make a space for any form of religiosity. Some critics believe that that's part of our so-called weakness, but it all depends on a number of factors. It strikes me, in any case, that openness, radical hospitality in relation to anything. Not many places or cultures or societies are so as open as African societies, which allows for an extraordinary plasticity, an extraordinary capacity to engage with that which is coming from afar. We are not afraid of that which is coming from afar, gods included. And we have developed an extraordinary capacity to mix all of that, produce those mixtures. The classical technical term is syncretism, but it's a pejorative term, so let's not use it. A capacity for creolization, let's put it. Blending together elements which at first sight do not seem to go together. We managed to blend them together. And we have created, in so doing, cultures that might look cacophonic, if you want, but in fact are full of life and extraordinary dynamism. So religion, as a matter of fact, is part of that foundation. That you build a house, you have the foundations. Religion belongs to the realm of the foundations. And its main major function, as I see it, has been to attend to the process of healing. Process of healing which is required, has been required by the history of brutalization we're talking about. We wouldn't have emerged out of that long history of brutalization more or less intact without that attachment to what you do not see, what is beyond those forces which move the universe and individuals, and give some meaning to why it is that we are here. What are we doing here? Why is it that the day we are no longer here, something is missing or someone is missing? These final questions of ultimate meanings, religion has helped to attend to them. And in attending to them, to appease the mental violence we have been subjected to. So I see it playing exactly the same role today in face of political violence, in face of economic insecurity, in face of the uncertainties and instabilities of the times. And that's how I see it. And I think that is still a repository for deep forces which we can invoke and assemble as we try to move to the next step.
I'm going to end with a very delicious question which comes from one of our hosts in Brazil. But before I do, just a reflection on the religion question is that I think for, I won't say a lot of people because I can't measure this accurately, there's a transcendental moment that is occurring, especially in places like Africa where religion has largely been imposed or it's been superimposed on some of the indigenous practices and cultural rituals or things that we've needed to do to own and affirm our existence here. And I think for me, just on a personal note, there is more of a leaning towards this time being a time of personal responsibility in a way that, religions have sought to create a distraction or, in my estimation, a fake balm for the wounds that it has allowed history to inflict upon us, a movement in a new direction in the world which harnesses some of what we call indigenous religious or traditional religious systems or philosophies or the notion of what existentialism is. And I think that's an important note to make in a context where some of us are leaning away from deity and back into self and accountability.
Yes. You wanted to comment on that?
Well, I would love it if
no,
I could
I
hear
find
your
it
thoughts
extremely interesting because what you are putting on the table are the contradictions inherent in some thing like religion, which is, you suggest, a historical occurrence or invention, which means that it is full of contradictions. It can go anywhere. It can be used in any way possible. It was imposed, of course, but it was also embraced by some who, Christianity for instance, who wanted to part ways with traditional systems which they found oppressive. The talk about Christianity in particular, we witnessed the secession by a number of Africans from established churches coming from Europe, and the institutionalization of African churches with their own interpretation of the gospel, liberation churches. What I mean is that religion is not necessarily the opium of the people. It can also be a key element in their project of emancipation and liberation. In America, in Black America in particular, Black Americans from slavery on would have never survived without some relationship, sense of transcendence, so to say. But as far as personal responsibility is concerned, you see, what strikes me is the fact that, strikes me, a number of studies done by anthropologists in particular highlight the fact that in some of these new churches, the question of personal responsibility is absolutely at the core of the new gospel. Now, of course, we have to insist on personal responsibility without losing sight also of that which is beyond personal responsibility. It's not true that if we fail, it's always a matter of individual responsibility. It is also a matter of structures. But it's maybe a part of the discussion we probably don't need to have in the official. But you opened up a huge set of questions I would have loved to.
I think this conversation you and I are definitely going to have over some wine, if that is your poison, in the weeks to come. Let's end with this one from Eugenio Lima, who indicated that the book Critique of Black Reason, which was published in 2016 for N1, your Brazilian publishers, he did the same for Afrotopia by his friend Felwin Sarr. So some intellectuals like Bruno Latour say that Brazil will have a fundamental role in the world in the coming decades. According to him, nowhere else in the world, and I think you touched on it briefly as well, do climate and political crises coexist with such intensity. Brazil is experiencing a perfect storm, saying Brazil today is like Spain was in 1936 during the Civil War. It is where everything that will be important in the coming decades is visible. So in your opinion, how does Brazilian racism or racism in the Brazilian reality impact this perfect storm, taking into account there's significant evidence that Brazilian authorities, including the president, at some point in the near future will answer for crimes against humanity and be investigated for genocide? What role is Brazil likely to play in this new moment in the world? I like it when there's a pause. It means these questions are really reaching inside of you, and you've got to summon all of your abilities to answer, because it is an important one. It's a pivotal and a tangential moment that's kind of happening, at the same time.
You see, he mentioned questions of racism at some point in his question. There are three, as far as I'm concerned, there are three, see some words come in French, so I have to translate. Three nodal centers, historical nodal centers, matrices of racism in the modern world. The first one is, of course, the United States of America and the Caribbean, let's say, where modern racism, anti-black racism, was not only invented, but legislated for, implemented with the effects we see. We saw then and we see now. A racial order that was instituted in America. That's one model. The other model is South Africa. And the third model was Brazil. So you have these three modern models, paradigms of how it is that racial rule is conceived of and implemented and executed, and with what consequences, and how do we manage the consequences in such a way as to allow that model to keep reproducing itself and transforming itself as history goes by. Now, in the kind of world of debates, which is academia, one model has become somewhat of the paradigm for all the others. It's the African American model. They have been able to think about it, conceive of it, study it, and elaborate a discourse on it, which has become somewhat global. So that in spite of the specificities of the South African model or of the Brazilian model, we all keep referring to Black America when we are looking for to articulate a discourse on the fact of racism. And we look for concepts there, we look for theories there, we look for empirical examples there, and we do not take seriously our own historical experiences. I've seen it here, for instance, with my own students. Now, all of this means that if we are serious about fighting against racism as a global problem, not as a US problem, but as a global question, then we absolutely need to draw a bit more from the other two matrices, Brazil and South Africa. And we need to triangulate them so that when we speak about racism in America, we necessarily have to see its refractions in other places. Otherwise, we have a provincial discourse.
And one-dimensional.
One-dimensional, one locational. We need a planetary discourse on racism in this age, which is a planetary age, as we have been trying to argue since we started our conversation. Now, Brazil is, of course, a huge, not only country geographically, but it's a concatenation of many different histories and many different worlds, in a way that is not exactly what we see in the USA, or in a way we see in South Africa, because South Africa too is a concatenation of histories and worlds. Our interest in Brazil as Africans derives from the fact that it's the second most important black country in the world. It derives from other factors, but more importantly, it derives from the connection between Brazil and Africa, which I have to say, in spite of many efforts, connection which remains somewhat unthought politically. it has been written a lot about it. There's space to write more, but we haven't taken that connection as the object of political meditation, out of which we tease a certain number of consequences. And I want to look at Brazil from that point of view. That's all I can say about, the question that was raised.
So if we were wrapping this conversation up ordinarily, I'd be shaking your hands profusely. We are in this COVID-19 moment, so you accept my handshake virtually and in my heart. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective, for sharing your wisdom and your intellectualism, and for everyone who's going to watch this conversation. I hope that you enjoy it and it triggers something in you beyond just the enjoyment of a conversation, but into action in your community and perhaps a shift in your own conscience, in your own consciousness, and perhaps even your conscience. So thank you very much, Achille and Mbembe, for joining us today and for agreeing to be part of this important conversation. Really do appreciate you.
Thanks, Iman. Thank you.